Hello, my name is Karen Dakin, and as chair of the William Birkett Willams Memorial Lecture Series Committee, I welcome you today. First Lieutenant William Birkett Willams served as a pilot for the 57th Fighter Group. At the age of 23, he was killed in action in Libya during World War II. First Lieutenant Willams' family endowed and established a lecture in his name to bring renowned speakers to Fairmount to address topics of interest to the larger community. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dale Hilton, recently retired from the Cleveland Museum of Art, as our speaker. Dale was Director of Adult and Distance Learning at the CMA. She holds an MA in Art History from the University of Chicago and a BFA from Virginia Commonwealth University. In Dale's 28 years on the museum staff, she has presented lectures, gallery talks, and developed 47 video conference scripts. She is also the author of several publications. Dale will be presenting a number of works of art from the CMA collection, all on the theme of Stations of the Cross. There will be a few pauses during Dale's presentation for her to answer questions. She will also answer questions at the end. Please open the chat function and use it to submit questions, starting each question with capital Q, : Also, please change your Zoom setting from gallery view to speaker view. And now I present Dale Hilton.
Hello, greetings, and thanks so much for this opportunity to be with you today. The subject, the Stations of the Cross, was actually planned to be an in-person talk for the Easter season, but like so much else this year, health concerns required us to rethink all this. So we have an August presentation via Zoom. Today, as Karen told you, we're going to be looking at images from the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art. As you know, the Stations of the Cross refers to a series of images depicting Jesus Christ during the final day or so of his life. The stations grew out, and will be familiar to many of you. The stations grew out of the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, which is believed to be the actual path that Jesus walked to Mount Calvary. The object of the stations, of course, is to help Christians make a spiritual pilgrimage through the contemplation of the Passion of Christ. I'm going to turn off my video now so that you can really focus on these images. Our first series of images show Christ before Pilate. And the one that you'll see now is from a Book of Hours. A Book of Hours is a Christian devotional book, and they were very popular in the Middle Ages and beyond. These hours are ancient divisions of time, and they're also known as the daily offices. They were developed by the Christian church and serve as increments between the prescribed prayers of the daily rounds. And if you are really pious, you would have up to 7 of them, including some that occur at 2 a.m. So this was something that was often done in monasteries where people devoted their lives to prayer. Books of Hours, again, from which this small miniature comes, are the most common type of surviving medieval illuminated manuscript. And they're differences between each and every one, since they're unique and hand done. However, most Books of Hours do contain text, prayers, and psalms, and other decorations such as this one does. Some were made for very wealthy patrons and may be extremely lavish, as we see here, with full-page miniatures and gold patterned backgrounds and brilliant colors. All of this is in evidence in this one. These brilliant colors come from expensive imported pigments, such as ground lapis lazuli, and that is what creates the intense blues that we're looking at here. The next work also shows Christ before Pilate, but unlike the previous image from an elaborate book of hours, this one is rougher. It's a hand-colored woodcut. The figures display, even though they're somewhat more crude in their execution, they display a greater emotional range. If you look at some of the details I've delineated for you, you'll see Pilate's hands twist as he deliberates about the judgment he must make regarding Jesus's fate. His aged face shows the stress of answering to Tiberius while managing the population of Judea. The clamorous mob contrast with Jesus' very radiant, calm demeanor. The unknown artist of this work uses the power of the woodblock very expressively. His bold lines and the crowded yet legible composition create a narrative with great immediacy even today, some 500 years later. We now move rapidly, as we'll do for the rest of the talk, through several of the stations. By the way, these are very selective stations. They are not, I've not included all of them, but I wanted to really focus on the works of art themselves. So I'm trying to show a variety of different media, different types of artistic expression, and very compelling images. So we are moving on now to Jesus Mocked and the Crown of Thorns. After Jesus' condemnation by Pontius Pilate, Jesus, was flogged and mocked by Roman soldiers. They put a crown of thorns on his head and placed a staff in his hand representing a scepter. There's one artist, though, the one whose work you see on the screen, who shows Jesus with a crown of thorns well before his adulthood. This artist, Francisco de Zurbarán, is showing us a quite unique view of Jesus. Rather than taking a story from the Bible, Zurbarán, the Spanish artist of great renown, appears to have invented this subject in which Jesus pricks himself on the crown of thorns. And I know it's small on your screen, but he's actually holding his finger in wonder, and there's a tiny, tiny red drop of blood coming out of one of the fingers, and that's what Jesus is focused on. He's weaving the crown of thorns, and of course this foretells his later torment during the crucifixion. Despite the grand scale, and this is a very large painting, which is usually on view at the museum, so I hope you will have a chance to see it. Despite the grand scale and the monumental figures, the work has remarkable intimacy and a very quiet sense. And these types of ideas about these figures are really emphasized by the smallest of details, including tears that we see on the Virgin's cheeks. I know you probably, again, can't see this on the screen, but they are rolling down her cheeks. Stories of Christ's childhood and adolescence become increasingly popular during the Counter-Reformation when Zurbarán painted this scene. They were easily understood by a broad public. Further, works such as this confirm the Church's renewed focus on faith in contrast to earlier Reformation charges that the Church institutions had abused their considerable power. In this engraving by Albrecht Dürer, Christ sits on a throne like bench surrounded by his tormentors. The crown is so spiny that one of the men holds it with a pair of tongs while another forces it down onto his head. Christ is mocked as the King of the Jews, and he has been given his scepter, which we see here in a detail, which is a sapling or tree branch from which, according to legend, another cross could grow. Dürer, a painter and printmaker, established his reputation and influence across Europe when he was still in his 20s due to his high-quality woodcut prints. He was in communication with the major Italian artists of the time, including Raphael, Giovanni Bellini, and Leonardo da Vinci. And from 1512, about when this engraving was made, he was actually patronized by the Emperor Maximilian I. This print is one from a series of 16 engravings known as the Engraved Passion, to distinguish this set from 2 woodcut passions made by Dürer. Some of these sheets, however, even though they were intended to be a set, were sold singly during his lifetime. In the upper corner, you will see a picture of the praying hands, and I wanted to include this because it may be familiar to you. This is one of the iconic works of Dürer, who is credited with bringing the Renaissance to the north and to Germany and beyond. So you've probably seen his work, and if you've seen the praying hands, then you do know who Dürer is, of course. Our next group of images deals with Christ carrying the cross. The Christian faith informed of a French painter and printmaker, Georges Rouault. He was a pioneering expressionist painter, even though we're looking at a print here, and he was influenced by the German expressionist, though not formally associated with that group. Rouault created pictures recognizable by thick black brushstrokes that outline their subjects. Some liken his work with its heavy black lines in areas of separate color cells to decorative glass work, a look that is often attributed to the artist's teenage years spent as a glass painter's apprentice. Rouault studied at the École des Beaux-Arts and later associated with the Fauves, well-known Fauves such as Henri Matisse and André Derain. But rather than creating pleasing armchair pictures like those of many of his contemporaries, Rouault applied his painterly style to religious themes, using these motifs to reflect on religion, morality, and modern life. The simplicity of style and enduring focus on religious subjects actually put him at odds with many art critics of the day. Some found his themes overly traditional and the feeling of his works too somber, too concerned with the sufferings of Christ. Rouault explained what he was trying to convey in the following way. He said, deep down inside, the most unfriendly, unpleasant, and impure creature, Jesus dwells. I'm showing you a detail of this work. It's an enlargement of the thick black lines that surround the figure, because if you look closely at them, you'll see they have a rather bubbly texture. And this is one of the great pleasures of aquatint. Aquatint is one of a family of techniques that's used in intaglio, and that is the kind of prints that include etchings and soft grounds and so forth. These prints, intaglio prints, are the family of prints that contain the ink below the surface of the printing plate. So again, if you're looking at the bubbly character of these black lines, you are actually seeing an artist who could really get the best, most expressive, most interesting line quality out of the aquatint process. This woodcut also uses its medium to very great expressive effect. This is by an artist relatively little known whose name was Guido Cotterin. He lived from 1892 to 1976. And he's been called one of the most elegant and original Venetian painters. Of course, he was also a printmaker of the 20th century. He's devised here a scene of great feeling as Jesus comforts his mother and bears the heavy cross across the cobbles. A critic described Catterin's independence from the prevailing modes of the day. When Catterin was asked to join a group of avant-garde Italian artists, the so-called futurist, in the 19-teens, the artist Catterin categorically refused. He wrote later in his journal, quote, "I'm a spiritualist and an uncorrupted vegetarian. I feel outraged, and after reading their books, I just want to burn them and never reply." So in other words, he was an ardent traditionalist, both in his methods and in his subject matter, but I think we are the richer for viewing his artistry today. And again, there's a little detail on the screen that shows you the character that's available with woodcuts, with the background with a few remaining chunks of wood that caught the ink on their surface. And we'll stop here and see if you have any questions about anything you've seen so far. The Dakins are very kindly checking the chat function.
We do have two questions, Dale, on the first painting with Jesus as an adolescent.
Yes.
The first question is, can you say more about the imagery in the painting with the two doves?
Yes, let's go back to that. Yes, this painting is full of symbolism. It's a stunning and deeply effective and affecting painting. First of all, you see the doves. They are thought to represent the Holy Spirit. Second of all, the roses and the lilies refer to qualities of Mary, her charity and her purity. And the open and closed books on the table between the two major figures represent Old Law, New Law, or Old Testament, New Testament. Of course, the open books represent the New Testament, which an artist such as Zubran would feel was predominant or took precedent over the Old Testament.
Okay, here's another question on that same painting. In fact, it begins, on that same painting were those subtle images of angels or cherubs over the young Christ.
Yes, I don't know if you can see them on whatever the size of the screen you're looking at, but it is a technical tour de force. There are dozens of tumbling cherubim in that golden shaft of light. And I'm going to put my cursor on their little tiny faces. And if you see some bits of kind of darker red, that would be their rosy cheeks and their eyes and so forth. I actually have seen a digital image of this painting under extreme magnification, and you just are stunned by how many little cherubs there are. And the thought is here that this golden light is not a natural light of this world, but rather showing the divine fate that is planned for Jesus.
Another person asks or comments that he or she is not familiar with the expressionist artist. How do you spell his name?
Rouleau.
That's the next painting, obviously.
Well, if it's this work, you can find a fair amount of information on him. The last name is Rouault. He's a 20th century French artist.
Those are the only questions, so we can continue, Dale.
Sounds good. We'll now turn to the sixth station of the cross with Saint Veronica. According to church tradition, Veronica was moved with sympathy when she saw Jesus carrying the cross to Golgotha and gave him her veil so that he might wipe his forehead. Jesus accepted the offering, held it to his face, and then handed it back to her, the image of his face miraculously impressed upon it. The veil was said to possess the grace of God and was able to quench thirst, cure blindness, and even raise the dead. The 16th century Dutch artist Lucas van Leyden, whose work we see here, was a child prodigy. He was apprenticed first in his father's studio, and this was often the case in the Renaissance, that famous artists started out as the children of renowned artists as well. So they had training in their parents' studios from the earliest days, and this was very true of Lucas van Leyden. After working in his father's studio, he apprenticed to a second painter and very soon emerged as a successful artist in his own right, doing both paintings and engravings. A contemporary has characterized Lucas van Leyden as a tireless artist who, even as a child, actually annoyed his mother by working long hours after nightfall, which she forbid, not only for the cost of candlelight, but also because she felt that too much study was bad for his sensibilities. In 1521, van Leyden met Albrecht Dürer of Germany, whose compositions and use of chiaroscuro, dark shadows and dramatic lighting effects, had a profound influence on his work. So these artists, van Leyden and Dürer, actually did know each other. And it's pretty staggering to think about that. In this scene, a very touching one, not a print, not a painting, but rather a relief sculpture that is projecting from the background, we see a demure Veronica, here she is kneeling with Christ, and then we see Simon, the figure with outstretched arms, who is helping carry the cross. This is a very sophisticated sculpture with a variety of poses, and especially noteworthy is this wonderful figure in motion, whom we see from the back. This is a remarkable achievement for an artist to use this kind of imagination of the movement of figures in space. This relief sculpture, as we call them, that are not fully in the round, but rather affixed to a back, is actually made out of alabaster. And it probably came from what is known as a choir screen, or a barrier between the altar and the congregation, which was a common feature in medieval churches. Yet the sculpture is more classicizing than medieval. In other words, it looks back to the naturalistic proportions of classical art. The artist is not known. However, it is thought that he, whoever he was familiar with the work of Jacques de Broek. De Broek was an artist from the Netherlands who brought a taste for the Italian Renaissance back to northern France and present-day Belgium. The use of alabaster instead of marble is noteworthy as well, and this is a material that would have been found more locally in northern Europe. The date of this is 1545. We move now to the crucifixion with several very compelling images. This racking image, again, is by Albrecht Dürer. It's part of a cycle of prints, The Small Passion, that the artist started after his second journey to Italy around 1505. It consists of 36 woodcuts and a cover page. It is a very detailed story of martyrdom and the agonizing death of Christ. This subject was especially popular in Germany in the 15th and 16th centuries. The church used this type of art, especially woodcut prints such as this, to tell often illiterate parishioners about the last day of Christ's life. The title of this series, The Small Passion, distinguishes it from the Great Passion, also completed around 1511. So you can get a sense here of how productive an artist Dürer actually is, because he has to title these series of works depicting the Passion of Christ, some of which include the Stations of the Cross. He did so many of them that he has to give them separate titles for everybody to keep them straight. With this literally excruciating image, Dürer creates an art for our engagement. We empathize with Christ's searing pain. Dürer's introduction of classical motifs into Northern art through his knowledge of Italian artists and German humanists has secured his reputation as one of the most important figures of the Northern Renaissance. This is reinforced by his theoretical treatises which involved principles of mathematics. He was very interested in math and science and anatomy, and perspective and ideal proportions. One of the little details that I wanted to call your attention to is the fact that even his monogram here, the great A for Albrecht and the D for Dürer, is in perspective. So it's receding back into space in the same plane, if you will, as the ground upon which the major figures interact with each other.
We have a question about
this work is a miniature, such as we've seen before.
Excuse me.
It is by an artist that was familiar with Albrecht Dürer's work, but we don't know who this artist is either. This is not derived necessarily from a known engraving or drawing by Dürer, but it's thought that the style, the composition, and especially the modeling of the figure shows Dürer's influence. Again, we do not know the name of this artist. The miniature depicts the moment that the cross is raised. In the foreground, there are thuggish brutes who are struggling to bring it upright. You can see one that's trying to get some leverage as he places his foot upon the bottom of the cross to raise it higher. There are also little details such as the skulls at the bottom, the bones of Adam that we see in Golgotha, which was alleged to be Adam's burial place outside the walls of Jerusalem. And in the background, there's a brilliant blue sky that recedes onto the horizon. The inclusion of illusionistic trompe-l'oeil, that is, fool the eye because they're so realistic. The inclusion of realistic trompe-l'oeil items in the border, which is strewn with flowers and butterflies, follows the tradition of Northern Europe, specifically Ghent and Bruges, where such borders were first developed in manuscript illumination during the 1470s and the 1480s. This leaf, though, is later, circa 1510. We've had some questions, at least during the dry run for today's talk, about these small objects in the border. So I wanted to talk a little bit about them. They're called marginalia for obvious reasons. They're in the margins of pages such as this. They often graced the edges of manuscripts, sometimes independently from the text, and expressed a content that seemed fairly remote from it. So you see here a picture of rugged bumpkins who are raising Christ's cross in a relatively crude manner, not in their style, but just through their thuggish behavior. And yet in the borders are these very refined and delicate carnations, roses, little worms, and so forth. So it seems as if the marginalia is in some degree of disassociation with the little miniature. Well, according to the art historian, Michael Camille, medieval books of hours are filled with, quote, visual noise. I think that's a great way to describe marginalia. Visual noise that situate the pious believer at the edge of the profane and the sacred. That is, that sometimes the marginalia are not quite as tame as what we're seeing here. And sometimes they're so-called drolleries, they're little dragons, or even things that would be figures in socially unacceptable activities. So there are all kinds of things that we see in marginalia, but they coexist on the manuscript page. It should also be pointed out that occasionally marginalia can be added after the manuscript is completed. So it may or may not be part of the original intent of the artist who produced such books of hours and individual illustrations of books of hours. Some of the things that we've seen in marginalia are translations, glosses, that is, extra interpretations, little inscriptions of what is going on in the miniature illustrations, decorations, coats of arms, diagrams, personal notes, doodles, or demonstration of artistic skill. So little flourishes of virtuosic talent. So marginalia in themselves are actually of great interest to scholars, and depending on the nature of the imagery can be viewed either as enrichment or desecration of the original illustration. And now we come to a stunning work of art, very large scale, often on view at the CMA. And I wanted to make that point with some of these works because the works on paper or vellum, such as the illuminated manuscript or the prints, are not typically on view, but paintings such as this one by El Greco are. Here, the artist El Greco shows the cross now fully raised and Jesus in agony on it. El Greco, the Greek in Spanish, was trained on his native island of Crete as a painter of small-scale devotional images, icons as it were, in the Byzantine tradition. And some people can see remnants of that style in the way he painted faces. In the late 1560s, El Greco moved first to Venice and then to Rome and finally settled in Toledo, Spain. The graphic depiction of blood, again, it may not be clear on your screen, but there is some very dark red paint dripping from the nails in Jesus' palms. These things, these details may reflect the Spanish interest in Christ's physical sufferings as a subject for meditation. El Greco's very dramatic and expressionistic style was met actually with puzzlement by his contemporaries, but as you may be aware, it has found enormous appreciation in the 20th century and beyond.
Yes, there are some questions that have been submitted. What is the scale of the door woodcuts, and what is the wood that allows such incredible detail?
Many of the Dürer woodcuts are about the size of a cell phone. They're actually small and they're so powerful. As to the wood, I really can't answer that, but it would have to be something that is somewhat easy to carve and does not have a grain that would get in the way of the image. So I would think that something like oak would not be a suitable wood, but I don't know specifically what he used.
And where would the Dürer woodcuts cuts be displayed?
I'm so sorry, Karen, your question.
Oh, excuse me, I'll be closer. Where would the Dürer woodcuts be displayed, in a book format or separately framed?
Oh, they were mostly in book formats.
And we have a question regarding the El Greco painting.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, in the El Greco painting,
Yeah.
what is the inscription on the head of the cross, and what is its significance?
So, unfortunately, I've got a bar of Zoom icons that are actually obscuring that, but generally something like that will have identification of Christ, his initials, or so forth, or King of the Jews or something like that.
And who would have commissioned the El Greco crucifixion painting?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Spanish royalty, and I can't really quote you who exactly, I'm sure others can, began by commissioning works from El Greco. But his works were considered so odd in his own day that the commissions were not numerous from the court. So eventually the commissions came more from the church, but they weren't as numerous as perhaps with some other more conventional artists.
Though there are no more in the question area.
All right, so we'll continue on. We now move to the 13th station of the cross, the deposition. We're looking here at an etching by Rembrandt, and it's part of a series of scenes from the Passion of Christ that Rembrandt created around 1654. Here, he diverged from traditional representations of the descent from the cross, which is also known as the deposition. And Rembrandt focuses on actually the silent activity of taking down and burying Christ's body. Only the bottom portion of the cross is visible, so this area right here. And Christ's head is actually in partial shadow. This is a highly unusual treatment of the subject. The figures that carry him and the hand that reaches up from below to support his head are depicted in a bright light. So in other words, normally Christ himself is the center of any Christian painting, but here Rembrandt is actually showing us the activity and the interaction of the people that are taking down the body. The salient elements we find in this etching include the striking diagonal composition and the prominent darkness which echoes the sobriety of the subject. The print shows Rembrandt's penchant for thoughtful presentations of routine subjects and his command of the rich black tones possible with etching. The next image, also of the deposition, dates from about 1250, and it's the earliest that we've seen today. This single leaf or page has been excised, very regrettably, from something known as the Potocki Psalter, and the work is painted on vellum. The Psalter is named after its last private owner, Count Stanislaus Potocki. Psalters were books containing biblical psalms and commonly used for private devotion. The Potocki Psalter provides a superb example of Parisian Gothic painting at its most refined, with strong emphasis on line and color. In this miniature, we can see the new court style of King Louis IX, who lived from 1214 to 1270, in which tall figures assume sinuous postures and the drapery forms large broken folds around the body. The high quality of the painting suggests the original Psalter was destined for an aristocratic patron. As you may have heard, most manuscripts were produced in monasteries in the early Middle Ages, but from the 12th century on, scriptoria or manuscript studios began to develop in cities. Paris, the seat of the French kings, emerged as one of Europe's most prominent artistic centers and was the site of the first lay workshop for the production of manuscripts. These urban studios served not only the clergy, but masters in schools or universities and the nobility, and also the new mercantile and professional classes. So there was a demand for this kind of sacred imagery, both from royalty, say, academia, and also from this rising merchant class that could actually afford these very expensive productions. We're looking at something that may be stunning in the context of everything else we've seen today. And this very modern deposition of 1928 is by the French artist Albert Glaise. He was one of the founders of Cubism. And in this abstract composition, I'm wondering if you can discover the figures and their activities. So yes, this is a religious scene. I will say that many of the Cubists, particularly earlier in the development of Cubism, did use compositions or did create works that were very muted in tone. They often did this in order to focus on the composition or on the particular presentation of an artistic idea so that you wouldn't be distracted by color necessarily. So as this may look extremely quiet and kind of shadowy with its grays and apricots and so forth, it is deliberate on the part of the artist as someone who is deeply enmeshed in Cubism. Glaise was known as a practicing artist and an art theorist, and he devoted years of thought to what he saw as the urgent problems of his era. He was deeply distressed by the unfulfilled promise of the Russian Revolution. That is, he was troubled by the failure of collective organization to solve society's woes and also to account for individual human differences. Further, he remained unsettled about the painter's role in the world. After a period of personal angst, Glaise came to regard the social principles of early Christianity as a way out of what he perceived as society's imminent collapse. Eventually, he returned to Catholicism for his practice and religious themes such as this for his art. A harbinger of this very slow transformation of his life occurred as early as 1918, when it is reported that Glaise came to his wife and said, quote, "A terrible thing has happened to me. I believe I'm finding God." Our next deposition, or Descent from the Cross, is a 17th century sculpture. It was created from a single elephant tusk. For Karl Eusebius, Prince of Liechtenstein, the artist, Adam Linkhart, spent 7 years carefully plotting and carving its features and their locations. It is the last known sculpture and indeed the pinnacle of his career. The biblical accounts from the descent from the cross found in the Gospels are actually not consistent, which makes it a little confusing to try to identify specifically who the characters are that surround Christ and surround the cross in this sculpture. But be that as it may, the intense emotion registers on the faces of the figures in this scrupulous and exquisitely detailed work. And I did want to point out these tiny piercings here, which show where the nails have been removed. There are bones around the feet of some of the figures, again, referring to Golgotha. The musculature and bone structure of Christ are truly stunning, and the breeze ruffling the hair of this athletic man who's gingerly handing down the body are things to be admired. They are absolutely breathtaking. Adam Linkhart is an important German ivory carver. No surprise there. It is believed that Linkhart studied in Italy, where he was inspired by sculpture from classical antiquity and also by Renaissance artists. Linkhart, as you may imagine, made stylistic decisions based on the particular grain and shape of the ivory piece he was working with. So he had to be very, very cautious about where he cut and how the grain ran of this tusk, and yet it all looks as if it's as detailed as a painting. So he was able to achieve this very difficult assignment that he set for himself and was commissioned by this Prince of Liechtenstein. Ivory itself was actually a popular material for religious subjects, especially during the 17th and 18th century. And Southern European countries, actually such as Spain and Portugal, had it a little easier than the Northern European countries, such as we see here, because they had all kinds of territories overseas where you actually might more easily find ivory, such as the Philippines and Mexico and Goa. We move now to the entombment, which is the last station we discussed today. And we see again an ivory work. This is a diptych, a two-paneled screen that shows, in this detail particularly, bereaved figures lovingly laying Christ to rest. Such objects were used for private devotion by their aristocratic owners. Several scenes appear on this 14th century work, and you can see the complete work here on the other side of the slide. What we see is Christ's entry into Jerusalem, the raising of Lazarus, the crucifixion, and the entombment. These images suggest choices made by the original owner who wished to contemplate these aspects of Christ's passion. Notice the pointed Gothic arcade bordering the scenes and the naturalistic drapery of the tiny figures. The name of this highly accomplished artist is unknown. What I'd like to do now is finish up by showing you a final work that presents multiple scenes of the Passion of Christ or the Stations of the Cross. This is another multi-scene diptych, two-panel screen, such as the little ivory that we just viewed. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, artists often created works with several scenes of Christ's life. This diptych is hinged at the center, and you can see them in the center of your screen, and that allowed it to be opened and closed and easily transported. It was clearly designed as an object for private reflection. The owner would have been the one to choose the scenes that he wanted, and so just selected a few from the Passion of Christ where he or she could pray before these scenes. The top two images depict Christ flogging at the pillar and the crowning of thorns, with the lower two showing Christ before Pontius Pilate and in the Garden of Gethsemane. I'm going to start my video again and just finish up by saying that through this talk, we've mostly viewed single scenes, but the Stations of the Cross were considered as thematic sets by which to focus one's devotions. These skilled and often deeply moving works are reminders to us today of aristocratic patronage, artistic ability, materials both rare and ordinary, the breadth of creativity throughout the ages, and finally, a reminder of people's faith. In closing, I'd like to thank Fairmount Presbyterian Church and the superb Birkett Willams Lecture Committee for their support and the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Dale, thank you. And it's been really a wonderful presentation. We do have several more questions and actually one comment. The comment refers to the El Greco piece, and the viewer went to the website of the CMA and saw this inscription for that piece.
Oh, great.
Inscription or plaque at the top of the cross in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So that's what was on the El Greco.
Confirmation.
Yeah. We have a question here. When psalters were produced in France, did they tend to do multiple copies of the same thing or stress the uniqueness of each production?
Oh, that's a really interesting query. As illuminated manuscripts, there would be certain expected elements, such as the Psalms and so forth. But the illustrations themselves, because they were hand done, would vary bit by bit. They were not done by individual artists. they were done by workshops, so that you would have, and this goes for the books of hours too, you would have somebody who specialized in the miniature illustrations that knew particularly how to draw figures. You might have a different person perhaps working on the background, someone maybe a little less skilled with figures, and somebody else would do the writing, the text. You'd have what is known as historiated initials, which would be big, beautiful initial letters starting off a prayer. Perhaps somebody, in addition, did that, and then the marginalia were the work of specialized artists too. So there were certain common factors, I guess we could say, in summary, but there was variation, as you might imagine, because these were hand-produced works of devotion.
We have another question here regarding the sculpture made from the elephant tusk, and
Yes.
that is how tall is the descent from the cross in that sculpture?
It is just about 18 inches tall.
And people are interested in sizes. The next question has to do with that as well. And this is for the 4-panel ivory carving. What is the size of that carving?
It's very small. It's about 8 inches by 4.5 inches. It's a little bit larger than a cell phone.
There are numerous comments that are thanking you for your very wonderful presentation. I think, oh, here's one, another question, but in the midst of the praises you've received. What are the angels holding in the ivory panel of the entombment?
If this is the scene that people are asking about, it's too small for me to see. So I'm going to recommend that everybody go to the Cleveland Museum of Art website, and there's a little tool on the website where you can focus on certain areas of most of the works, or not on every work of art on the CMA website, but most of them, and you can enlarge them. I mean, very typically angels will hold musical instruments, but for this, I don't know. So that is yet to be discovered by our participants today.
Would you also mention the other works of art that are on view that people might be able to see when they, and if they go to the museum?
Sure. Well, generally anything on paper or vellum is not on view because these are light sensitive. And once they're on view for a few months, then they have to be so-called rested. So you wouldn't see any of the manuscripts or the prints that I showed today, but something like this little ivory carving is generally on view, although galleries are switched out just to keep things fresh, I will say, on a schedule of every 3 to 5 years. So this little ivory carving would probably be on view, the El Greco, the descent from the cross from the elephant tusk, and the big Zuberon of Christ as a teenager weaving the crown of thorns. The best way to make sure that you get to see what you're interested in is to go to the Cleveland Museum of Art website, click on the word art along the top as a navigational term, and then search by artist name or keywords such as crucifixion, and you'll get a little row of thumbnails. As you go through them, you can click on the one you're interested in, and when it comes up as an enlarged piece, you'll see information on it, including whether or not it's on display. If it's not on display, it will say not on view. If it's on display, it will tell you exactly which gallery that it's hanging in, and you can find it.
Well, that is very helpful information. I appreciate that. And I want our viewers to know that the comments thanking you for a wonderful presentation, I will share with you so that you do get to see them. And I want to thank Dale for sharing her expertise with us today. Most of the works of art Dale presented are not on display, as she mentioned, because of their sensitivity to light. Therefore, we are especially fortunate to have been able to view and discuss them. I also want to thank the other members of the William Birkett Willams Memorial Lecture Committee, Jeff Barnes, Joyce Pope, and Carl Hoffman, and Pastor Jessie McMillan for her contributions to our committee. The tech support that Caleb Stripes and Jim Dakin provided has been invaluable. In addition, I want to thank Christine Winters, Fairmount's office manager and marketing and communications lead, whose expertise has been essential for today's presentation. One of Cleveland's gems, the Cleveland Museum of Art, is open and is welcoming visitors again after having been closed for several months. I urge all to take time to visit this treasure, one of our nation's top art museums. Thank you all for joining us today.